Have you noticed how modern life seems to leave people more guarded, more impatient, and less emotionally available than they once were? Have you ever wondered how much of what we call toxic behavior is less about intention and more about long-term adaptation to constant pressure? These questions matter because they shift attention away from blame and toward the environments shaping everyday behavior, often quietly and over long periods of time. If you feel comfortable sharing, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and at what point in your day this reflection is finding you. Modern life rarely announces its influence loudly. It does not arrive with a clear instruction or a visible turning point where a person can say, "This is where I changed. This is where something hardened inside me." Instead, it works quietly. Through repetition, through atmosphere, through the slow shaping power of conditions that surround a person long before they are aware they are being shaped at all. Most people do not wake up wanting to become difficult, emotionally sharp, defensive, or draining to be around. Toxic behavior in its early stages is rarely a goal. It is far more often a response, a pattern learned slowly in environments that reward certain reactions while punishing others, environments that make some traits impractical and others almost necessary for psychological survival. Modern life is defined by constant exposure. Exposure to expectations, to comparisons, to information, to judgment, to subtle competition that never fully turns off. Even in moments of rest, the mind remains partially alert, scanning, evaluating, anticipating. This continuous low-level pressure does not usually cause immediate breakdown, but it changes how a person relates to themselves and to others over time. Emotional spaciousness begins to shrink. Patience becomes costly. Softness starts to feel inefficient. In earlier environments, psychological stress often had clearer boundaries. There were periods of effort and periods of recovery, moments of social engagement, followed by genuine isolation, problems that appeared and resolved within visible limits. Modern environments blur those boundaries. Work enters private life. Social evaluation continues long after physical interaction ends. Identity becomes something that is not only lived, but displayed, measured, and silently ranked. Under these conditions, the nervous system adapts. It learns to stay activated longer than it was designed to. It becomes quicker to interpret ambiguity as threat, quicker to defend, slower to trust. None of this feels dramatic from the inside. It feels practical, necessary, even rational. A person may simply feel that they are being realistic, cautious, efficient, or honest, without noticing how much emotional armor has been added layer by layer. The environment also teaches people what is safe to express. In fast, competitive, and performance-oriented systems, emotions that slow momentum tend to be discouraged. Confusion, vulnerability, uncertainty, and hesitation rarely receive patience or protection. Over time, they are pushed inward, not processed but stored, while more forceful expressions like irritation, sarcasm, control, or emotional withdrawal take their place on the surface. These expressions move faster. They require less explanation. They protect the self from appearing weak or behind. This is often the first quiet shift toward toxicity, not cruelty, but compression. Emotional life becomes narrower, more utilitarian, more focused on self-preservation. A person may stop asking how something feels and start asking whether it works, whether it costs too much energy, whether it exposes them to risk. The environment rarely challenges this shift because it often benefits from it. Modern systems tend to reward responsiveness over reflection, decisiveness over nuance, confidence over accuracy, emotional restraint over emotional understanding. When these rewards are repeated often enough, they shape behavior in predictable ways. People learn which traits move them forward and which ones slow them down. Over time, this learning becomes internalized, no longer experienced as external pressure, but as personality. The phrase toxic person often implies an individual flaw, as if the behavior appeared fully formed from within. But what is usually missing from that picture is context, the constant scarcity of time, the invisible competition for relevance, the background anxiety of falling behind, the subtle message that rest is laziness, that sensitivity is fragility, that patience is inefficiency. These messages are rarely stated directly, but they are absorbed nonetheless. In such an environment, self-protection becomes central. Boundaries become rigid rather than flexible. Empathy becomes selective rather than expansive. The emotional bandwidth required to sit with another person's complexity starts to feel unavailable. When someone expresses distress, it may register not as a shared human experience, but as an interruption, a demand, an additional weight placed on an already strained internal system. This is how environments quietly convert stress into behavior, not through conscious choice, but through repeated adaptation. A person who once listened carefully may begin to interrupt. Someone who once offered understanding may begin to dismiss. Someone who once questioned themselves may begin to project certainty. Each step feels small. Each step feels justified by circumstance. Modern life also reduces the visibility of long-term consequences. Interactions are fragmented. Relationships are often temporary or transactional. Feedback loops are delayed or distorted. When harmful behavior does not immediately lead to social correction, it can persist unexamined. A sharp comment earns attention. Emotional distance prevents conflict. Control creates predictability. These outcomes feel stabilizing in the short term, even if they erode trust and connection over time. What makes this process particularly difficult to notice is that it does not feel like becoming worse. It feels like becoming more adapted, more capable, less naive. The environment rarely labels these changes as toxic. It often labels them as maturity, resilience, or strength. A person may even receive praise for becoming tougher, less emotional, more assertive, without recognizing what has been lost in the exchange. This is why the environment must be examined before the individual. Because when the environment consistently applies pressure in one direction, it would be unusual if people did not bend. Toxic behavior, in this sense, is not an anomaly. It is a predictable outcome of prolonged psychological strain combined with systems that prioritize output over inner coherence. None of this removes personal responsibility, but it complicates the story. It suggests that before asking why someone behaves harmfully, it may be worth asking what they have been adapting to, what has been demanded of them repeatedly, and which parts of themselves have been made inconvenient or unsafe to express. The environment comes first, not because individuals are powerless, but because environments shape the range of available responses long before conscious choice enters the picture. By the time behavior is labeled toxic, it has often been rehearsed thousands of times under pressure, reinforced by subtle rewards and justified by survival logic that once made sense. In modern life, Toxicity rarely announces itself as hostility. More often, it arrives disguised as efficiency, detachment, realism, or strength. And it begins quietly in environments that make those traits feel necessary, long before anyone stops to ask what they cost. When modern life applies pressure continuously, the first thing that changes inside a person is rarely belief or values, but emotional space. The inner room where feelings are noticed, named, and allowed to unfold begins to shrink. Not because those emotions disappear, but because there is less time, safety, and attention available to hold them without interruption. Instead of emotions moving through their natural arc, they are compressed. Irritation replaces reflection. Numbness replaces sadness. Defensiveness replaces fear. These substitutions are not chosen consciously. They emerge because certain emotional states are easier to carry in fast, demanding environments, while others feel too slow, too vulnerable, or too costly to sustain. Modern life rarely provides long, uninterrupted periods of psychological quiet. Notifications, expectations, deadlines, and social signals fragment attention into small units. Under these conditions, emotional awareness becomes shallow by necessity. There is little opportunity to sit with discomfort long enough to understand it, so the mind looks for faster exits. It reaches for reactions that resolve tension quickly, even if they do so bluntly. This is where emotional compression begins to shape behavior. When feelings cannot be fully processed, they are condensed into more manageable forms. Subtle disappointment turns into cynicism. Ongoing stress turns into impatience. Uncertainty turns into control. These compressed emotions are easier to express, but they carry less information and less empathy. Over time, they become the default emotional language. What makes this shift difficult to notice is that it often feels like efficiency rather than loss. Responding quickly feels productive. Keeping emotions short feels mature. Avoiding emotional depth feels like focus. The environment reinforces these interpretations by rewarding speed, clarity, and emotional restraint, even when that restraint is actually emotional avoidance in disguise. As emotional range narrows, tolerance narrows with it. Small inconveniences begin to feel disproportionately irritating. Other people's emotions start to feel overwhelming or unnecessary. Empathy, which requires time and presence, begins to feel like an optional expense rather than a basic human function. This is not because empathy disappears, but because the internal resources required to access it feel depleted. Emotional compression also changes how conflict is experienced. Instead of being something to explore or understand, conflict becomes something to neutralize quickly. Conversations are shortened, nuance is removed, listening is replaced with positioning. The goal shifts from mutual understanding to emotional relief, and the fastest route to relief often involves dismissing, minimizing, or dominating the other person's perspective. Under sustained pressure, even self-awareness becomes compressed. There is less curiosity about internal states and more emphasis on external performance. Feelings are judged by whether they interfere with functioning rather than by what they reveal. If an emotion slows productivity or complicates decision-making, it is pushed aside. Over time, this habit creates distance from the self, making it harder to recognize when behavior has become sharp, rigid, or emotionally harmful. This internal compression does not stay internal. It leaks outward through tone, timing, and emotional availability. Responses become shorter, less patient, more transactional. Kindness becomes conditional. Understanding becomes selective. These changes often appear subtle, but they accumulate. Relationships begin to feel strained, even when no single interaction seems severe enough to explain the shift. Modern life also normalizes emotional crowding. Being busy, overwhelmed, or constantly stretched is treated as normal, even admirable. Admitting emotional overload can feel like admitting incompetence. As a result, many people carry compressed emotional states without acknowledging them, moving through daily interactions with a background level of tension that shapes every response. In this state, it becomes easier to misinterpret others. Neutral behavior can feel intrusive. Questions can feel like criticism. Requests can feel like demands. The compressed emotional system is more reactive, not because it is fragile, but because it is overloaded. It has less capacity to absorb ambiguity or uncertainty without triggering defensive reactions. Over time, this reactivity can begin to define how a person is experienced by others, not as someone intentionally harmful, but as someone difficult to approach, emotionally closed or unpredictably sharp. From the inside, this often feels unfair. The pressure feels external. The reactions feel justified. The emotional compression remains largely invisible to the person experiencing it. This is how modern life transforms constant pressure into personality traits. What began as a temporary adaptation becomes a stable pattern. The nervous system learns that staying compressed is safer than opening up, that emotional distance reduces risk, that speed prevents vulnerability. These lessons are reinforced daily until they feel natural. Emotional compression does not create toxicity in a dramatic way. It creates it gradually, through the slow erosion of emotional spaciousness. When there is no room to feel fully, there is little room left for others either. And in environments that rarely slow down, this compression is not only common, but quietly encouraged, even as it reshapes human behavior in ways that make connection harder and harm easier to justify. In every environment, certain traits rise not because they are healthier, kinder, or more balanced, but because they function more efficiently within the rules of the system. Modern life is no exception. What makes it distinctive is how quietly and consistently it rewards behaviors that, over time, erode empathy while reinforcing emotional hardness, self-focus, and psychological distance. Most reward systems are not explicit. They do not announce what kind of person they are shaping. Instead, they signal value through outcomes. Attention, status, security, and momentum tend to flow toward those who move quickly, speak confidently, and show minimal hesitation. Nuance often slows progress. Emotional sensitivity complicates decisions. Doubt interrupts forward motion. In environments that prioritize speed and output, these qualities become liabilities rather than strengths. Over time, you begin to notice which versions of yourself are met with ease and which are met with resistance. Directness moves things forward. Emotional restraint avoids friction. Assertiveness attracts recognition. Meanwhile, careful listening, uncertainty, and openness to being wrong tend to go unrewarded, or worse, interpreted as weakness. These patterns are not imposed through force. They are learned through repetition. As these rewards accumulate, behavior adapts. Confidence becomes performative rather than grounded. Certainty becomes a posture rather than a conclusion. Emotional detachment becomes a strategy rather than a temporary state. None of this requires malicious intent. It emerges because the system repeatedly affirms certain expressions while quietly discouraging others. What complicates this further is that the rewarded traits often look admirable on the surface. Decisiveness appears strong. Emotional neutrality appears mature. Boundary setting appears healthy. Yet, when these traits are reinforced without balance, they drift away from their original function. Decisiveness loses its connection to understanding. Boundaries harden into walls. Emotional neutrality turns into emotional absence. In competitive environments, comparison becomes unavoidable. Metrics, visibility, and performance cues constantly signal where you stand relative to others. Under these conditions, self-worth becomes entangled with outcomes. When worth feels conditional, self-protection intensifies. It becomes safer to dominate than to collaborate, safer to dismiss than to engage, safer to control than to trust. This is where empathy quietly loses its footing. Empathy requires cognitive space and emotional availability. It asks you to slow down, to hold complexity, to tolerate uncertainty. Systems that reward speed and clarity indirectly penalize this process. Over time, empathy begins to feel inefficient, even risky. It exposes vulnerability. It complicates narratives. It interferes with clean decision-making. As these internal calculations repeat, behavior shifts subtly. Interrupting feels acceptable. Oversimplifying feels necessary. Dismissing emotional nuance feels practical. These responses are reinforced not because they are kind, but because they produce immediate results. They shorten conversations. They reduce emotional demand. They protect attention and energy in overstimulating environments. The danger here is not that people consciously choose harm, but that the system normalizes traits that make harm easier to justify. When success is associated with emotional distance, it becomes tempting to reinterpret detachment as professionalism and insensitivity as realism. Over time, this reinterpretation reshapes moral perception. What once felt cold begins to feel normal. You may begin to notice that the traits most visible around you are not necessarily the ones that foster trust or connection, but the ones that command space. Loud confidence outshines quiet thoughtfulness. Certainty eclipses curiosity. Presence becomes performance. In such environments, those who remain emotionally open may feel increasingly out of place, as if they are operating by outdated rules. To adapt, many people adjust not only their behavior, but their internal standards. They stop expecting understanding. They stop offering it freely. Emotional generosity becomes selective. Trust becomes conditional. These shifts feel protective, even wise, especially when repeated experiences suggest that openness is rarely met with care. As the system continues to reward hardness, the cost of softness becomes more apparent. Being emotionally available invites interruption. Being reflective invites challenge. Being empathetic invites responsibility. When these costs are felt repeatedly, it becomes easier to withdraw than to engage, easier to assert than to listen, easier to judge than to understand. This is how toxic patterns become aligned with success. Not because harm is rewarded directly, but because the traits that reduce relational friction and emotional labor are consistently reinforced. Over time, this alignment blurs the line between effectiveness and emotional harm, making it difficult to distinguish adaptation from deterioration. You may not notice this shift while it is happening. It often feels like becoming sharper, more capable, more resilient. But beneath that surface competence, something quieter changes. The range of acceptable emotional responses narrows. The threshold for empathy rises. The space for mutual understanding contracts. When systems reward the wrong traits long enough, those traits stop feeling wrong. They begin to feel necessary. And in environments where necessity defines normality, behavior that once would have raised concern becomes simply the way things are done, quietly shaping people into versions of themselves that function well, but connect poorly. Self-protection begins as something reasonable. It emerges from exposure to stress, unpredictability, and repeated emotional strain, offering a way to stay functional when openness feels costly. In modern life, protecting the self often feels not only sensible, but necessary. Boundaries tighten, expectations lower, emotional availability becomes measured. These adjustments initially reduce overload and restore a sense of control. Over time, however, the function of self-protection can shift. What once helped regulate stress begins to shape how relationships are approached, how conflict is interpreted, and how other people are experienced. The protective response does not remain situational. It becomes habitual, and habits, when repeated without reflection, slowly redefine what feels normal. You may start to notice that caution replaces curiosity. Instead of wondering what another person means, you anticipate what they might demand. Instead of entering interactions openly, you prepare defenses in advance. This preparation feels like intelligence, even wisdom, because it prevents surprise. Yet it also prevents connection. When protection becomes the default posture, openness begins to feel unsafe even in neutral situations. This shift rarely announces itself clearly. It does not feel like choosing harm over care. It feels like conserving energy. Emotional investment becomes something to ration. Attention becomes selective. Responsiveness becomes conditional. Each decision makes sense in isolation, especially when resources feel limited. But together, they form a pattern that others experience as distance, rigidity, or emotional coldness. Self-protection also changes how accountability is perceived. Feedback feels threatening. Disagreement feels personal. Requests feel intrusive. When the nervous system is oriented toward defense, even gentle signals can register as pressure. The response is often to push back, withdraw, or assert control, not because the situation requires it, but because the system has learned to expect harm. As these responses repeat, emotional habits solidify. Sarcasm replaces vulnerability. Detachment replaces disappointment. Control replaces trust. These substitutions are efficient. They reduce emotional exposure. They create predictability, but they also flatten relational depth. Interactions become about management rather than mutual presence. In this state, empathy becomes more difficult to access, not because it has disappeared, but because it conflicts with the protective strategy. Empathy requires letting another person's experience matter, and mattering feels risky when emotional safety is fragile. To maintain protection, empathy is minimized, rationalized away, or reserved only for a very small circle. Over time, this selective empathy can begin to feel justified. You may tell yourself that not everyone deserves understanding, that emotional distance is realistic, that caring less is simply part of growing up. These beliefs do not arise from cruelty. They arise from adaptation to environments where emotional openness repeatedly felt unrewarded or unsafe. The harm appears when protection is no longer flexible, when it is applied universally rather than selectively. When it is used not only to prevent harm, but to avoid discomfort, complexity, or emotional responsibility. At that point, self-protection begins to externalize its cost. Others feel dismissed, controlled, or emotionally neglected, even as the protected self feels increasingly isolated. What makes this transformation particularly difficult to reverse is that it often feels like strength, endurance, resilience. You may receive validation for being unbothered, for setting firm boundaries, for not taking things personally. These signals reinforce the protective posture, even as it limits relational capacity. Conflict, in this context, becomes something to win or avoid rather than understand. Conversations are shaped by positioning. Listening becomes strategic. Compromise feels like vulnerability. The goal shifts from connection to control, not out of dominance, but out of fear of exposure. As self-protection hardens, emotional feedback from others may change. People may withdraw, become guarded, or respond with similar defensiveness. This feedback is often interpreted as further evidence that openness is unsafe, reinforcing the original protective stance. The cycle becomes self-sustaining. At this stage, toxicity is not an intention. It is a side effect, a relational byproduct of a system that rewards emotional armor and punishes emotional risk. The person inside the armor may feel exhausted, misunderstood, or alone, while those outside experience them as cold, rigid, or harmful. Modern life accelerates this process by rarely offering clear signals to soften. Recovery time is limited. Emotional repair is postponed. Reflection is replaced by momentum. Without interruption, self-protection continues to evolve, slowly redefining identity around survival rather than connection. When self-protection becomes harm, it does so quietly. It does not feel like a moral failure. It feels like adaptation taken too far. A strategy that once reduced pain now extending beyond its original purpose. And in environments that rarely slow down enough to examine this shift, that harm can persist unnoticed, shaping relationships long before it is recognized for what it has become. Toxicity rarely announces itself as a problem once it has been absorbed into daily life. By the time it becomes visible, it has often already been normalized, woven into expectations, language, and behavior patterns that no longer feel remarkable. What once would have raised concern begins to register as realism. What once felt harsh begins to feel efficient. What once felt emotionally distant begins to feel professional, mature, or simply necessary. Normalization works through repetition. When certain behaviors appear frequently and without consequence, the mind adjusts its standards. Sharpness becomes acceptable. Emotional unavailability becomes understandable. Dismissiveness becomes honest communication. These shifts do not happen because people stop caring, but because the environment teaches them which reactions are expected and which ones are inconvenient. You may notice that interactions increasingly rely on emotional shortcuts. Assumptions replace questions. Labels replace curiosity. Tone replaces meaning. In fast-moving environments, depth slows things down, so surface-level judgments take its place. These judgments feel protective. They reduce uncertainty. They help categorize people quickly in a crowded psychological landscape. As these shortcuts multiply, the emotional texture of everyday interaction changes. There is less room for misunderstanding, but also less room for grace. Mistakes are interpreted as character flaws. Vulnerability is treated as instability. Complexity is treated as obstruction. Under these conditions, people adapt by presenting simplified versions of themselves, often colder and more controlled than their inner reality. Normalization also alters collective expectations. When emotional availability is rare, it stops being expected. When patience is scarce, impatience feels justified. When kindness requires effort, its absence feels neutral rather than harmful. This shift is subtle, but powerful. It lowers the emotional baseline without ever naming the loss. In these environments, calling out harmful behavior becomes complicated. Toxic patterns are often defended as boundaries, efficiency, or realism. The language used to describe them is sanitized. Control becomes leadership. Emotional withdrawal becomes independence. Insensitivity becomes honesty. These reframes protect the behavior from scrutiny by giving it socially acceptable explanations. You may find that discomfort is increasingly individualized. If an interaction feels harmful, the assumption is that you are too sensitive, too slow, or too demanding. Responsibility shifts inward rather than outward. This internalization keeps the system intact because it discourages collective reflection on the environment itself. Over time, the absence of emotional repair becomes normal. Conflicts end without resolution. Ruptures go unaddressed. People move on rather than mend. In temporary or transactional relationships, this avoidance feels practical. But when it becomes a default, it erodes trust and reinforces emotional distance as the safest option. Normalization also dulls awareness. When behavior is common, it becomes invisible. Sharp tones blend into background noise. Emotional neglect feels ordinary. Psychological harm is recognized only when it becomes extreme. Everything below that threshold fades into acceptability, even though its cumulative effect is significant. You may notice that expectations adjust downward. You stop anticipating understanding. You stop offering it freely. Emotional generosity becomes rare, then optional, then unnecessary. This is not because people no longer value connection, but because repeated disappointment reshapes what feels realistic. As toxicity becomes normalized, it stops feeling like something to resist. It feels like something to manage. People learn to navigate around it rather than question it. Humor becomes a coping mechanism. Detachment becomes a shield. Irony becomes a language of survival. These adaptations make life tolerable, but they also deepen the underlying pattern. Modern life accelerates this normalization by rewarding adaptability without questioning its cost. Those who adjust quickly are praised. Those who struggle are pathologized. Little space is given to ask whether the environment itself is psychologically sustainable. Instead, individuals are expected to adapt indefinitely, even as adaptation erodes emotional capacity. The most unsettling aspect of normalization is how it reshapes identity. You may begin to see yourself as someone who is naturally distant, naturally impatient, naturally guarded, without remembering the conditions that shape those traits. History fades, context disappears, behavior feels inherent rather than adaptive. In this state, toxicity no longer feels like harm. It feels like reality, like adulthood, like the price of functioning in a demanding world. And because it feels normal, it is rarely questioned. It is passed along through interactions, reinforced through systems, and absorbed by those entering the environment for the first time. There is no clear moment when normalization completes itself. No final shift. It simply continues, quietly lowering expectations, narrowing emotional range, and redefining what is considered acceptable human behavior. The result is not dramatic collapse, but gradual erosion. Modern life does not require people to become toxic. But when its pressures remain unexamined and its rewards remain misaligned, toxicity becomes an understandable outcome. Not as an exception, but as a pattern. One that blends so seamlessly into daily life that it becomes difficult to see where adaptation ends and harm begins. And even harder to imagine how things might feel if the environment allowed something softer to survive without penalty. There is a point, often unnoticed, where softness stops feeling like a natural human quality and begins to feel like a disadvantage. Not because it has lost its value, but because the environment no longer knows what to do with it. In modern life, softness struggles to find a place where it is not misunderstood, exploited, or quietly discouraged. Softness takes time. It requires pauses, emotional openness, and a willingness to remain present without immediate resolution. These qualities do not align easily with systems built around speed, optimization, and constant output. As a result, softness is often reframed as inefficiency, hesitation, or lack of resilience, even when it is none of those things. You may notice that expressing care invites expectation. Showing patience invites delay. Offering understanding invites responsibility. In environments already stretched thin, these invitations can feel overwhelming. Over time, it becomes safer to limit emotional generosity, not because it lacks value, but because its cost feels too high. This is how softness begins to feel risky. It exposes you to emotional labor without guarantee of reciprocity. It slows momentum in cultures that prize decisiveness. It complicates narratives that prefer clarity over complexity. When softness repeatedly leads to exhaustion rather than connection, withdrawal starts to feel like self-respect. Modern life rarely provides clear boundaries around emotional exchange. Work, social life, and identity blur together. Being emotionally available in one area often spills into others. Without structural limits, caring becomes endless, and endless caring becomes unsustainable. In response, people begin to ration warmth, offering it sparingly or not at all. As softness recedes, toughness fills the gap. Not dramatic toughness, but quiet hardness. Emotional minimalism, reduced responsiveness, strategic indifference. These traits create psychological distance, which in turn reduces emotional demand. The relief is immediate. The cost is gradual. You may start to notice that being gentle requires explanation. Being firm does not. Being understanding invites debate. Being dismissive ends the conversation. These asymmetries shape behavior. Over time, people learn which version of themselves is easiest to maintain within the system. What makes this shift particularly disorienting is that softness does not disappear internally. It is often still felt, but hidden. Care becomes private. Sensitivity becomes internalized. Emotional depth retreats from interaction and survives only in solitude. This split creates an inner tension between who you are capable of being and who the environment allows you to be. As this tension persists, identity adapts. You may begin to see yourself as someone who is not that emotional, not that sensitive, not that attached, even if those qualities still exist beneath the surface. Language adjusts to protect behavior. Detachment is reframed as clarity. Distance is reframed as balance. The loss is rarely named. In environments where softness is undervalued, people who retain it often feel out of place. They may be told they take things too personally, care too much, or expect too much. Over time, these messages shape self-perception. Softness becomes something to manage, suppress, or justify, rather than something to trust. This dynamic does not only affect individuals, it reshapes collective culture. When softness retreats, relationships become thinner. Interactions become efficient but emotionally shallow. Support becomes conditional. Understanding becomes transactional. These shifts are subtle, but they accumulate. You may notice that emotional repair becomes rare. Apologies feel unnecessary. Reflection feels indulgent. Moving on feels preferable to slowing down. Without repair, emotional residue builds. Resentment lingers quietly. Misunderstandings harden into assumptions. Distance grows without anyone clearly choosing it. The absence of softness also changes how pain is handled. Instead of being acknowledged and integrated, pain is minimized or redirected. Humor masks discomfort. Productivity masks exhaustion. Cynicism masks disappointment. These strategies keep things moving, but they also prevent healing. Modern life often celebrates resilience without asking what resilience requires. Endurance is praised. Adaptation is expected. Few questions are asked about the internal cost of constant adjustment. When softness is treated as expendable, people learn to survive without it, even if survival feels increasingly hollow. At this stage, toxicity no longer looks like aggression. It looks like absence. Absence of patience. Absence of curiosity. Absence of care. These absences are harder to confront because they do not violate rules. They simply reduce what is available. You may sense this reduction in subtle ways. Conversations feel flatter. Connection feels harder to sustain. Emotional warmth feels rare enough to be surprising. These experiences are often attributed to age, realism, or changing priorities, rather than to environmental pressure. Softness becomes something remembered rather than practiced, associated with earlier phases of life, with idealism, with naivety. Yet what is often missed is that softness did not fail. It was outcompeted by systems that made it difficult to maintain without personal cost. This is not a call to restore softness as a virtue or to reject hardness entirely. It is an observation of how environments shape which human qualities are allowed to remain visible. When softness is consistently penalized, it does not disappear because it lacks value. It disappears because it lacks protection. In modern life, toxicity is not only created by pressure and reward systems, but by the gradual sidelining of traits that require time, safety, and mutual care to survive. When softness becomes a liability, hardness fills the space by default. Not because it is better, but because it is easier to sustain. And as long as environments continue to reward survival over connection, this substitution will remain largely invisible, quietly reshaping behavior, relationships, and identity, without ever needing to declare itself as a problem at all.